I'll introduce myself and offer some greetings, and then of course introduce our featured speaker today, who will be in conversation with CJS faculty Sam Shonkoff. We are so honored to be hosting Michael Fishbane today. My name is Dina Aronoff. I'm the director of the Richard S. Dinner Center for Jewish Studies here at the Graduate Theological Union. I'm faculty here along with Sam Shonkoff, and as we thought about a series of public programs this year, as the months of the COVID crisis continue, we thought that the best offering that we could produce would be a conversation to bring speakers and to enhance and enable new ideas through conversation, rather than maybe the more typical academic style presentation, which is more frontal and kind of uninterrupted. We're really hoping that this can be a live conversation. This is the last of 3 programs. We hosted one on sacred time and practice. We hosted one on exile, diaspora. And this session today is on the subject of revelation, which I know is a subject that Sam is treating in a course by that name. And we were so delighted that a real luminary in the field of Jewish theology and Jewish studies generally could carve out time to be with us today, and that is Michael Fishbane. I do want to thank a few people. Thank you to Matthew Hartman, who is the administrator who helped create and host all of these online programs. I also would like to mention that CJS hosts a series of programs along with the Center for Islamic Studies. This program is called the Madrasa Midrasha program, and we have one coming up in May on the subject of Judaism and Islam as it intersects with psychoanalysis. Nomi Seidman, who used to teach at CJS, will be a part of that event on May 19th. Really interesting intersection of religious cultures and new modern perspectives, such as that of psychoanalysis. I also would be remiss not to invite you, I know that Sam can't invite you, to his inaugural lecture. We are very excited to announce that Sam is now the Taube family assistant professor of Jewish studies, and he'll be offering an inaugural lecture honoring that endowment and also establishing, I think, the very important contributions that Sam is poised to make in the field of modern Jewish thought. And Judith Plaskow will be offering a response, and that is next week at this time. So please join us for that lecture. And I will now introduce our speakers today. I've already mentioned that our own Sam Shonkoff will be in conversation with Michael Fishbane today. Sam teaches here at the Center for Jewish Studies. His research focuses primarily on German Jewish thought and Hasidism, as well as appropriations of Hasidic spirituality in relatively secular spheres. I think that one of Sam's trademark approaches is a kind of radical openness to the hybridity that is reality, and not shying away from the gray zones of religious life. His current book project investigates themes of embodiment in Martin Buber's representations of Hasidism, especially as it pertains to original sources. And Sam is in a unique position, I think, to make that contribution, given that he also is co-editor with Ariel Evan Mays of a wonderful anthology of Hasidic texts, Hasidism, Writings on Devotion, Community, and Life in the Modern World, among other books that he's edited and contributed to. So Sam, we look forward to hearing from you today. And it is also my honor now to introduce our featured speaker, Michael Fishbane, who I just shared with him moments ago. I have been studying Michael from your published works for all of my adult life. I teach very frequently from this oldie but goodie. I think it's the kind of text that sustains close readings. I tell my students, read it closely. The word choices are intentional and profound. And that's 30 years ago, to say nothing of the turn that you've taken in recent years in constructive theology and articulating new and contemporary modalities of Jewish thought. Michael Fishbane is the Nathan Cummings Distinguished Service Professor of Jewish Studies at the University of Chicago. He's the author or editor of over 24 books and many articles, etc. And his areas of research include biblical studies, midrash, medieval Bible commentaries, Jewish mysticism, as well as modern Jewish thought. Among his books are Biblical Interpretation in Ancient Israel, The Garments of Torah, Essays in Biblical Hermeneutics, The Kiss of God, Spiritual and Mystical Death in Judaism. Some of his recent books in contemporary theology include Sacred Attunement, and his most recent book that I believe Sam will direct us to as well, Fragile Finitude, a Jewish Hermeneutical Theology. Without any further ado, I invite our conversationalists to the stage, as it were. Thank you so much for being here, Michael and Sam.
Thank you. If I can speak first, I want to very much give my gratitude to GTU for the invitation and hosting this conversation at the birth of this new book. And to thank you, Professor Aronoff, for this lovely introduction. And it's a particularly wonderful privilege to be in conversation with my student Sam, who I can now say with great pleasure, Professor Shonkoff. Everybody should know the great pleasure that a teacher takes when they can see a person settled in a wonderful institution, able to teach so much in such a full form. So it's, in a certain sense, it's a father's privilege, as it were. But I'm very grateful both to the institution, to you, Professor Aronoff, and to Sam Shonkoff for the invitation to enter into theological conversation.
Well, the honor is very much mine. Yeah, thank you, Dina, for the welcome words, and welcome, Michael Fishbane. I remember vividly where I was when I first read Sacred Attunement, your 2008 work of constructive theology. I was sitting in my backyard in Toronto when I was an MA student, and just feeling infused with a kind of theological voice that was deeply new to me and also profoundly familiar, really touching deep chords within me. And I had the pleasure of really the honor of being a student of yours, and these years later being a lifelong student and also a fellow traveler on the path. And I am, it's really a tremendous moment right now with the release of this new 2021 book of Fragile Finitude. And I'm excited to be in conversation with you about the core issues, the core questions that animate your work, that bear upon questions of revelation, right? How we even begin to think about human divine encounter relations, the fruits of those moments, what that even means, and the opportunity and the challenge of doing theology today. I'm looking forward to this conversation with you, and to also, I just want to welcome all 67 of the rest of you souls in the room with us virtually. When questions arise for you, please, that is all of you, please feel free to put it in the chat, and we will have time later in the conversation to really bring some of that fresh air into the room with the questions coming from you. So, Michael, I want to begin with a question. You ask a question in Fragile Finitude. Is theology even possible in our time? And we live in a world with a lot of brokenness, a lot of disillusionment. And I want to just begin right there. Why theology? why engage in that challenging endeavor? What does that mean to you to do theology in this time?
Thank you, Sam. Well, as usual, your question cuts right to the heart immediately. I think the first honest answer is to recover hope and dignity of what it means to be stewards of the world and to be people in conversation with one another, and to be open to the mystery in its great diversity and ramifications, and not narrow that down to kind of particularisms or any kind of fundamental exclusion. So I'm old enough that my father was shot in the Normandy invasion. I'm old enough that my grandfather experienced pogroms in Russia and came to America. The Second World War was part of my childhood. And so I think it's fair to say that the notion of evil and the struggle for the good is not self-evident, and it's even less self-evident as we've moved to the modern period, where we take the postmodern crisis of intellectual experience very seriously, the limitations of the human mind, the radical nature of subjectivity, and not allowing that to veer off course into some personal feelings, but be able to speak objectively and frankly and take other things seriously, even as one tries to hold one's subjective ground. And to find regulative principles within the tradition, that the tradition retains or that can be revealed through the tradition, regulative principles for an ethical orientation, for a spiritual orientation, and to allow one, again, to experience the mystery of life, but to do that in an ethically responsible way. Judaism, as many religions now, are still going through their own reformation and their encounter with the modern world, and they're trying to find a new language. Part of what I've tried to do is to articulate for myself a language of honesty, a language of directness, and a language that puts me in conversation with interpretive communities, my own interpretive community primarily. I'm a practicing and committed Jew, but I am in conversation and have read quite a bit and with many other religions, and want to bring that conversation alive, and to also import powerful ideas into Judaism that are found elsewhere and give them a Jewish resonance. That's been the task of Judaism since antiquity, and I wanted to do that again. So I guess the summary answer to your question is I'm trying to keep my balance. I'm trying to keep my balance as a spiritual and honest person, to keep my eyes wide open before the problems, but nevertheless to want to maintain and enhance a great multi-millennial tradition.
I want to begin with some questions that are going to continue to sort of like acquaint this community with your thinking. And in your response just now, at one point, you, in reflecting on why do theology, you use the phrase to experience the mystery of life. And I think it's worth opening up this topic right now is for you, theology is not just a theoretical endeavor. It's not just an abstract discourse. It's not just proofs for God, right? It's not metaphysics. It seems to be some sort of experience, practice. You say in this new book, Fragile Finitude, at its core, theology is a prayer of the unsayable. And I want to invite you use this word theology in ways that might not be conventional, might not be familiar to some others. So what is theology for you in this moment in which you're doing it?
Theology begins with life experience. And it begins with learning how to orient oneself to the world and what confronts the claims that are made on the world. We'll come back to this larger issue of revelation, but the world is filled with throbbing possibilities, some of which have to be rectified and some of which have to be enhanced, but they all have to be responded to. And to learn how to respond to that throbbing diversity that is both nameable and unnameable, to put it into a form of language and practice that keeps one focused. Theology as a discipline is a way of living with the tradition so that its language can be reformulated as a form of focusing, as a form of engagement with the world, and to see through the presences of the world what is the deeper transcendent dimensions that take us and that shine through the present, but that are also more ineffably deeper than any particular encounter. So theology is a form of life in which I think I say at one point in Fragile Finitude that God comes, before God comes to the mind and language, God comes to the heart. There is an immediacy of our interactive pulsing with the world, perhaps a type of attunement, but to try to be in balance with the world and with persons and with everything that transcends that. The divine allows us to look beyond the incidental, but to see the incidental in its transformative and ultimate context. It allows one to live to try to live through the tradition in a coherent way of practice, so that theology tries to help address priorities. We live oftentimes with mixed internal feelings, with being not always sure how to balance certain kinds of positive and negative values in the world. And theology has given a historical voice to that. So theology is at the first instance both an understanding of the historical descriptions of what has taken place, but at the constructive level, it is to try to take one's own stand in the unfolding of a great tradition that has to meet the moment, which from our point of view is very complex. How do we orient ourselves? Theology is a type of orientation within an immensity of disorientations. So it's a question of how do you filter. The tradition helps that language does that, and theology as a personal discipline is a prayer, as you quoted in that sense. It's a prayer in the sense that one has to do repeatedly. I remember years and years ago when I was once reading 17th century English transcendental poetry, one of the writers of the poets spoke about when poems were written as prayers, it was spoken of as a self-consuming artifact. That is to say, you can't use it again. You have to move on to the new claim of new challenges, new revelatory moments. But at the same time, the artifacts remain part of the normative tradition, and they become prisms and holding forms of language, holding forms of action, which in a certain sense give us a sphere in which we can think and move. So theology begins with experience and it moves into life, and it grows into life through the density of a multi-millennial tradition, but no one has lived this moment before this moment, and only each individual has to give testimony to what is being seen, the testimony that the tradition can actually meet the moment in an honest way.
Your response here, I feel like really captures something that I find really unique and fertile in your theology, which is this kind of, on one hand, this deep textual engagement, this deep like exegetical hermeneutical plunge into traditional sources, and on the other hand, a kind of emptying out and focusing attention on just the most somatic, palpable, kind of immediate sensations of being alive. And we'll have to unpack more exactly the relationship between those two, because that, I think, gets to the core of some of your thinking, ways in which our attentiveness towards the texts of life and our attentiveness towards the texts of tradition interpenetrate in some way. But I wonder for now, can I invite you to read something from your work? I would love to hear. I mean, right, theology, as you really show and embody in many ways, is it's a personal voice. I actually don't know if I've ever heard you read from these books that I've read so much. So I would love if in Fragile Finitude, it's on page 21.
See if I can find that.
Okay. This is the beginning of interlude 1. Yeah. Okay. In the first 3 paragraphs there, just going from 21 to 22, I think you really help articulate here a kind of foundation, a starting place for theology in bringing awareness to sensation itself. I wonder if you could read this. Just
so that 21 right to the first 2 lines of 22 then.
And actually even the following paragraph.
Oh, okay. Okay, yeah. A serious reading.
Please, yeah. I invite our audience, even close your eyes. Please, okay. Let's hear this in your voice.
Living theology begins with lived experience and its verbal expression. This is its twofold ground. It is ever new because life circumstances change and require hermeneutical adjustments. And it is ever old because we are repeatedly affected by life experiences and instructed by teachings from earlier generations. Theology is thus comprised of the intersection of life and knowledge, events and their reformulation, both past and present. Experience is primary. We belong to the world first and always through the medium of our senses. The continuous impact of worldly stimuli on our minds and bodies is the primary reality of our lives. We are totally encompassed by this reality, even as we feel and process its impact from within. These sensations break into consciousness as tactile valences of heat and cold, light and dark, and wet and dry. Frustrations and satisfactions also have their effect. From within the crevice of awareness, things pass over and through our bodies, leaving traces of what has been for us to make sense of. Such pre-verbal experiences are not nameable as such, but nevertheless convey our initial sense of difference and degree, and condition such primary temporal sensations as this now or not yet. Perceptible distinctions of limit and longing gradually emerge as our responses become more deliberate and intentional. At first, negative limits are conveyed by a vocal cry, the primordial expression of needs or solicitation, and positive realities by a coo, the incipient expression of somatic gratitude or relief. Eventually, these sensations are annotated as patterns of expectation and encoded into the neural fibers of our being. When some lack causes distress, physical or emotional, the anxieties of absence can be overwhelming. These ruptures or inconsistencies are as primary to our lived reality as our sustenance and continuity. With them, the face of care, the expressions of love, is withdrawn, and the pathos of longing, the sense of limit, is felt with unnerving force. We are embedded in that which is and shall be our whole life long. However felt or experienced, the ways of this reality comprise the daily touchstone of self-awareness. It is actuality as such, wholly independent of how we construe or make sense of its impact. To lose touch with this realm through disregard or habit is to lose touch with the primary conditions or factors that affect our lives. Who could dismiss the elemental sensations of color and sound, pleasure and desire, or hunger and satisfactions? They solicit our attention in many ways, each one evoking a distinct concern and value for us. Instinctively, or with reflection, we seek to determine what ought to be in any given situation and act appropriately in response. With instruction and memory, we may become more calculating and deliberate, and then what ought to be, physical or ethical, assumes a more authoritative character. All this becomes the basis for trusted or anticipated knowledge. What seems achievable, this now, ingrains a sense of the possible, whereas what is deferred or potential, not yet, inculcates the quality of hope. We swing repeatedly between these poles, striving to keep the dread of anxiety, the fear of not ever at bay. But this primary emotion repeatedly breaks through because the particulars of life don't necessarily suit our personal needs. Self-centered, constitutively localized in body and mind, we come up short and settle on what seems suitable or available to our specific concerns. We thereby hope to close the gap for particular or practical purposes. But the primordial qualities of reality invariably exceed our cognitive grasp and remain ultimately mysterious and ineffable. An imponderable remainder hovers over our cognitive constructions, evoking the premonition of existence as an impersonal, often terrifying unknown. This cognizance is a primary impulse of theology. Inherently incommensurate with our minds, the eternal upsurge of existence is overwhelming and fundamentally nameless.
Thank you.
It's the first time I've read that aloud at all.
Well, it's an honor. So I want to like try to hear you trace, right? Like there's this way that your writing transports us as your readers to a very fundamental, immediate level, and then you sharpen our awareness of the fact that when we actually pay attention in that way, we realize how ineffable it all is, that we're in this swirl of sensation. And if we even try to begin to imagine what that field, that matrix would be in a pre-verbal, pre-thematized, pre-labeled way, it's just overwhelming. There's a sense of humility, perhaps terror in that place. And you refer in what you just read to this imponderable remainder that hovers, right? Like, and an awareness of that imponderable remainder being a primary impulse of theology. Later in the book, you say that to name that borders on the blasphemous, right? Like, to call that God is almost to betray it in some way. And yet this borderland, this point of awareness becomes this impulse of theology. What is that transition? How do you understand that? To go from there into theological language, into tradition. It could seem like a jump, but I know it's not for you, and I want to understand it more deeply.
So let me begin the answer by, in a certain sense, recapitulating part of what I read. It's a testimony to what it means to feel being alive. To begin with all the phenomenological awareness that we can muster, and that we even feel the feelings of a child as adults. But it's to feel the primacy of primary moments, and in the feeling of those moments, to be attentive to the way language tries to give it expression, even in the shriek or the cry or the coo. That's already a communication. And that fills and somehow stabilizes that anxious void. It fills it with meaning. It makes connection. But there's so much more. There's something always that exceeds. And perhaps the fear of the dark as children is that first sensation of that, but the fear of the unnameable that surrounds us is always erupting, even as the language that we use to name things dissipate and complete a circuit of communication. So at this very early stage in the book, I'm trying to begin the process of moving towards theology. And that first primary sensation that language does a lot of work, but language also opens us up to its limitation and everything that stands beyond it. And that numinous sensibility from the beginning is not nameable, it's not personal, it's just a suffusing there-ness that we keep trying to negotiate in order and that cultures then reorder and name, structure, and give coherence to. But these are primary moments on the way to coherence, and the realization that coherence is always breaking down. So that is beginning the process of feeling life as an experience, because theology grows out of life and it gives it kind of cultural dignity. But even those forms need to be reformulated so they can be lived in an authentic, real way. And we have to kind of rename them. So these first intuitions about that magnitude that we're calling the imponderable, the unsayable, precedes the cultural language of God. God is simply a cultural term. It's a certain term for a horizon of consciousness. But the great religions are always opening up that horizon in either through suffering and trying to close it, or that horizon of consciousness breaks on its own because the rationality of our attempts to make sense exceed what it means to be alive in many cases. So we struggle to keep up linguistic coherence. I think that a truly religious person has to understand the power of naming, what it means to call God into cultural presence and linguistic presence, and to use these powerful terms that tradition has dignified and which emerge from scripture and emerge from experience. Particularly Jewish language of God is very much reflected of how one stands and orients oneself in the world. It's more than ineffable. It borders on the blasphemous, because one has to realize the limits of human construction, right? God is more than the created world, and God is more than the linguistic and life possibilities that are given to us to shape and reformulate. And how we do that in dignified ways that hold on to those formulations that help guide us, but remain very much aware of our limitations. That's something of the fragile finitude, which has multiple resonances of what fragility means, what finitude means, but it reflects the theological language in the most ultimate sense. And so I wanted to convey that from the very beginning. And it's a thematic that takes on form at each of the successive stages of the book that go through religious experience, particularly Jewish cultural, ritual, cognitive, and other experiences. But it's ever hovering. It's ever hovering there, and the religious person has to sense both. You can't foreshorten the horizon, nor can you extend it infinitely beyond language. But we have somehow, this borderline, we can intuit a borderline, and that somehow we remain honest by realizing that whatever we always say something about God, or else we couldn't communicate. But we have to realize how fragile that is, how fraught it is, and how overwhelming it is even to say those kinds of terms, and simply hope that they will orient us towards this higher consciousness, which folds back into a sensitive dignity for every particularity of existence.
This awareness that you're describing, this recognition of the limits of language, and yet the necessity try, the inescapability of trying. I could imagine this sounding like just an inner experience, right? Just like a kind of mystical awareness of some kind. But I know that for you, this revelatory process of theology is also deeply ethical. That there's there is an interpersonal ethical thrust to everything we've been talking about, and I wonder if you could flesh that out a bit.
Big question, isn't it?
I don't mess around.
Right, I can see that. You never did, so let me. Well, let's start really. Let's start with our feet on the ground in the world that we were just reading about. Theology, and perhaps we use revelation in the larger sense of God's revelation of God's life into the world, makes a claim. These are our experiences initially, and even through the tradition, are events and occasions that call us to attention. Being called to attention means called to awareness and called to responsibility. And I don't mean these as kind of generalizations. I mean them in the most concrete sense that when a particular person is speaking, they are calling us to attention and obligation in a very different way. And in a certain sense, they, not just an event in nature, an event in society, but persons, they are Sinai moments in miniature. Why? Because the claim comes first. The claim comes first. And that claim, that claim means that I have to orient myself to what has imposed itself upon me. Religions of revelation begin with something coming from the outside. They don't begin with initiatives. They begin with receptivity. One becomes a religious person by being able to be receptive, to understand what it means to receive. And then standing in the presence of what manifests itself or what's given to be received unfolds its own law of love. It's not just law, it's love. How do I orient myself to that person? Each event has its own 10 commandments, has its own do's and don'ts. It has its own positives and negatives. And those become decalogues that we carry with each individual person, and sometimes have to kind of rewrite those or reinterpret them as new occasions. The religious moments, these paradigmatic moments, are giving expression to this for larger cultural dimensions, and its language also has to be re-inhabited, reformulated, so that those primary archetypal demands, 10 commandments, 10 words, or the multiple claims. So I think in the first instance, I wouldn't use the language of ethics, although you're absolutely right. It's the language of claim. It's the language of trying to articulate that response. In my world, everything is theological because God's presence is what gives us the world. And so every response means either it's an act of responsibility towards that, or it's an act of misuse and idolatry, or a distortion, or it's not seeing that image of divine presence that's coming, right? The multifaceted face that the divine presence presents to every aspect of the world, from the subatomic to the transcendental beyond are parts of the face of God as well. And so the response is responsibility. It's responding to what claim was. Now, that invites, obviously, dialogue. And did I understand you correctly? Am I responding rightly? Your reaction. So we're not simply dealing with one dyadic moment and it's a one-off, right? Responsibility invites one to the beginning of a matrix of that particular type, and there'll be multiple matrices. What a great tradition like Judaism does, and Christianity and Islam and the Eastern religions, is they help us understand these matrices in livable, ritualized forms. And hopefully the particular can be enhanced by these larger forms. But when there is a tension, there requires a new hermeneutical adjustment within the larger tradition, the same way that that's required when a person crosses my path and says something to me that stops me. Everything stops me in my tracks if I'm attentive. So that is, it's the moment, it's the claim, it's the occasion. These are kind of, I guess when I was probably your age, I guess, maybe it was still in the 60s, people used to speak about situational ethics. I'm not sure that that is a term that it was very, very common in Protestant theology at the time. But it's not that it's not just that everything is a one-off, but that situations sponsor their own site, their own space of happening. And also the mystery, did I get it right? Am I in tune with you? Are part of that issue, that the person is so much more than that immediacy that I responded to. So that the dialogical continuity in the interpersonal or in the life way is our most immediate experience of what the covenant at Sinai is. That's a covenanting. That bonding, which we're calling ethical, you chose to use it, but that bonding is the covenant. And then that's these are multiple modes within this archetypal term. Right? Maybe that begins to open that question up. I hope.
Absolutely. And to just go deeper into the question of covenants, the question of the image of Sinai, can I invite you to read another passage?
Pleasure. This is a totally new experience for me, so I'm happy to try to
write. For me as well. I'm enjoying it. So this one is Sacred Attunement. We're going back in time now.
All right. I remember those days. I remember them.
Back to 2008, page 59.
All right.
Just that one paragraph that starts about halfway down the page on 59. This is the covenant.
Okay. This is the covenant. The great vastness of world being is shaped into a sphere of religious instruction and duty for communal life. Moses begins the theological process as he stands fast in the God-effecting swirling howl and communicates religious norms for the people. He exemplifies a kind of spiritual living. Language is now a shaping of the illimitable into viable speech, articulating values and pious living. Moses had to stand firm in this divinely wrought vastness and experience its many interfusing possibilities. so that he could knowingly speak about a God who could not be imagined or portrayed. And he had to stand firm in the amoral welter of world being and know its inherent indifference to human plans and purposes, so that he could thoughtfully craft norms and values over this void. Something of God's all illimitable truth passed through him at Sinai, so that it could then become a human instruction, providing an ongoing religious ideal on earth.
What's it like reading theological language that you wrote almost 2 decades ago? What does that feel like?
I'm amazed that I wrote it. It still speaks. It still speaks my language. It conveys. It conveys who I am and how I want to be. I wrote Fragile Finitude because I'm so many years older. I'm much closer to the end of my life. I wanted to write something that would reflect integrity and honesty, becoming a saying of my truth at the end of my life, or as I could understand it, as long as I was able to think about it. And so it's reading this reminds me of a stratum that is still part of me. The Fragile Finitude has taken some of these thoughts and moved them into a more articulate form. I think I might have once told you, I hope I did, well, I'll say it. When I wrote the difficulty writing Fragile of Sacred Attunement was to find a personal voice that was personal but not idiosyncratic, and that I could own every phrase. It wasn't a metaphor that I'm really meaning X. So when I wrote it, I felt that theology had to be a prayer. Theology is prayer, of how I receive the world and how I want to step forward and continue. Reading this paragraph reminds me that this is still part of the prayer of trying to stand firm where the illimitable passes through, and trying to hold fast to values and to articulate them in a certain way. So, I must say, it may sound strange, but I haven't gone back to reread Sacred Attunement because it's an expression of a life, so it's good to feel that prayerful need of articulation that appears in that paragraph is still who I am, because I believe that. One can't stand it like Moses did, but we stand within the swirl, and we're trying to find language. And fortunately, we have multiple layers of tradition to help give some kind of armature or some form of regulation, but it doesn't always work. I remember, it's funny, I'll respond to my own inner associations, because as I'm reading this about Moses, the image that comes to my mind, I think must have been maybe the 7th or 8th grade. It's talking about a long time ago. I remember reading The Bridge of San Luis Rey, and this walking over this abyss in this walk this bridge over the chasm. And somehow it was true beyond my understanding. And I believe it's still a truth. And I think maybe from some deep place that that emerged through this formulation. I'd like to believe so, that my memory and that my strata go back even deeper.
Is there any difference between theology and revelation for you? I mean, I feel like on some level we've hardly opened up the term revelation, and on another level we've been speaking about it this entire time.
Well, yes and no, Sam. I mean, it's like talking about hermeneutics, right? It's a thing and a process, right? Yeah. So theology is a process of living in God's presence, but it's also a process of living in God's presence in the framework of tradition. So theology is also all that's been cultivated over the generations, the thoughts, the gestures, the interpretations, the ambiguities, the things that we love and the things that we resist because they just don't ring right, if they ever did, but they just don't ring right. But all of that is part of that historical theology, and each generation has to receive it and reformulate it. Many don't. The God of the fathers is sufficient. Since you done all your work on Buber, I remember one of Buber's earliest works at the turn of the century, when he was talking about levels of consciousness. He cited the teaching of the Baal Shem Tov, the kind of the pater familias, of the so-called founder of modern Hasidism, who was commenting on the opening line of the central prayer of Jewish worship called the Amidah, or the prayer. And it begins in the Hebrew, Elokeinu ve'Elokei Avotenu, our God and the God of our fathers. And he asked the question which many Hasidic masters following, says, why this formulation? When you're born into a community, it's the God of your fathers. And he emphasized that one has to take a stand for your God too, that you place yourself and your experience within the God of your fathers. So theology is both historical and constructive. It's both inherited from the past, and it's the immediacy of this is my God, and I'll try to stand firm with that in the totality of the tradition. I think that one of the things that should be conveyed, and I think particularly conveyed to your students as well, is that when we commit ourselves to a tradition, we commit ourselves to the fullness of its historical depth. But every generation since antiquity is making its own selection. That is to say, we do things, but we do things for different reasons. The process of, I think Jews don't use this term, but I remember first encountering it with some Christian theologians years ago in the 70s, who spoke about the canon within the canon. So that's to say, we find within our canonical concerns a center point that's even more compelling. It's our canon within the canon. It's the way that it speaks the truth of the tradition. So we commit ourselves to stand within the whole. We acknowledge it in its beauty and all of its diversity and its complexity. and its difference and its otherness and its mineness in that sense. But at the same time, we're aware that we choose certain passages to interpret. We highlight certain theological valences. We highlight certain kind of moral issues, and we try to hold fast with those until we have to keep our eyes on the world that's making a new claim. So it's that twofold of theology. It's the reception in the whole, with all of its obligations, and the need to say yes to it. I am within that stream of millennia. It's made me who I am. It's given me my language, but it's what is my particular voice? Even as I say the tradition, I say it in my voice. I have to own that voice.
Mm.
And that is theology in the most immediate sense.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to some questions from the audience here, and I really invite, if you haven't already, feel free to add more. This is from Jonah Gelfand, whom you actually met at an event last week as well. Jonah asks if you could say a bit more about this term. You use the phrase horizon of consciousness in reference to God, in reference to a theological awareness of God. Can you say a bit more about that phrase, horizon of consciousness?
So the first thing I would say is don't think about it in geographical terms. Don't think about it in spatial terms. Don't think about it as your mind that has a linear field. It's a way of expressing the limits of awareness, the limits of articulation. It's a way of thinking the border. It's always going to be in language. It's always going to be in language. We can't escape that. So it's always going to be wrong and idolatrous and limited. But the horizon of consciousness is, let us say, so think about it as an operative category, not as a fact. It's an operative category that makes you aware that the angle of view, the angle of value, is always conditioned by what I've known, see, can bring to mind, can bring to consciousness. The horizon may be very immediate in terms of I may be stuck in a whole series of texts that don't let me see much beyond them. They block my view. So that the horizon is also the place from which light begins to be felt. So it's a mode of awareness. It should not be spatialized. It's a way of thinking of the possibilities of limit and non-limit at the same time. Mm. I think I would just stop with that. I hope that helps Jonah, and if it's not, he can respond.
Thank you. We have three questions here that are all really related to one another. These are they all revolve around the question of universalism and particularism. One question is simply, are you a universalist? But others also are expand a bit more to say, Larry Milder asks, how should we understand the value of particularism if theology is rooted in an awareness that is pre-linguistic? Does Judaism have absolute value, or is it subordinate to some essential human awareness? And Sophia Freudenstein asks a related question, which is, I'm curious about why Jewish theology, based off of your explanation of theology and revelation. So why specifically Jewish theology, right? It seems to be more of a universal phenomenon to encounter and receive. Are we born into a specific hermeneutic, or is there more to it? So I wonder if you could reflect on how you understand this relationship between universality and particularism in your theology.
So I'm only going to gesture towards it.
Of course. Yeah, it's a big question. Another one.
So the first thing I would say to those who'd asked the question is I'm situated. I'm a situated person. I'm a situated person who received language from my parents, who received values from teachers and my parents. My sense of a wider world was included in my education. But no matter how wide that reading and experience is, I'm situated. I'm always situated. I'm situated historically. I'm situated with the language that I use. I can't speak multiple languages. I can only speak the language that has the deepest resonance to me. And if I find that it's constricting or too broad, I have to work with it so that it says what I mean by being at this point of intersection between the fullness of everything and what it means to be situated historically. There's no universal person. At least I don't think so. You're not born from a mother, or you're born from a womb. You're born somehow. You're born from a body and you live in a body. You learned your language at a certain time. It may not work, so you have to convert, or you may have to opt out. Or you may want to do some kind of a universal dance, whatever that would be. But even within that, what is the historically situated structure of values that you've chosen at this moment to say, I have to see things from this, let's say, multicultural point of view? That's not a universal standpoint. It's a particular moment that's come to consciousness at a very particular time in response to many things. And it may help a person think beyond the particularities, and that then one has to live with that tension. Those tensions are embedded in every particular religion. They may start with a kind of cosmic sense and move down to the particular. They may start with a particular and try over time in different ways to move to a more cosmic universal sense. If I start with the universal sense of the pre-thematic, is because that's where we all start. Who doesn't start there? Who doesn't start by being hungry and crying for food and being grateful when you eat? But how do I say food? What word do I use? That doesn't mean I deny other languages that say the word food. So I have to there are obvious tensions. I have to put food in my mouth. But thank God, these same traditions may open me to be aware that there are many other mouths that need food. That doesn't deny my mouth and my food and so on and so forth. So I have to live with these ethical tensions and these issues. I wouldn't know what it would be like to be a universalist without, I wouldn't have a thought in my head. I have to I have to think about my language, but my language can get screwed up. It may be part of a much larger sense of what grammar is. My syntax may be screwed up, so I have to think about that. So that's where I'm coming from. Over the course of life, obviously, I've different times evoke different ways to deal with that balance. I don't know, maybe our time is making claims to constantly be thinking beyond that. But we're constantly trying to determine what are the coordinates, and how do I live the coordinates? And then if you say that my balance of values is messed up, well, tell me that and we can talk about it. That's what it means to live in a community, in a polis, in a country that we can speak about these things in a world. So then you tell me you're too narrow, Fishbane, and you need to think about it like this, and then we'll talk. And then I might talk about something more universal, and I say, well, look where you are. You're a little bit more. So I think that's what I would want to suggest. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, it seems like this central, this very central term in your thinking of hermeneutics really speaks to this question, that if we are all hermeneutical beings, if we are always already interpreting, then that right there already undermines even this possibility of the ideal of sort of secular humanism. So
that brings us back to that first question you asked. So then I have to do that in a responsible way. And be doing that in a responsible way will change from being a 4-year-old to being a person my age. And with all the mistakes that we carry forward and all the positive things, I think.
Yeah.
You're right.
We have time for only one more of these amazing questions here. This one comes from Maury Lipson. It's in response to something you said earlier when we were speaking about the horizon, and you mentioned how suffering can close the horizon in some sense. And the question is, can you speak more about the role that suffering, pain, and service play in your thought? How does that fit into here? Suffering and service, distress.
Well, so let me answer your question pointedly, but let me just simply tell the readers, who I hope will read the book, that the opening chapter is a meditation on the book of Job, and that my understanding of that launches the book forward. But I would say that since we think about from our bodies, we think from our pain and need, and that allows us to be honest about what is happening, and it's honest about other people's pain. It provides a modality of honesty to think, from the beginning, what is dignified and what is to be born, and how do you express it, and how do you then create sympathy? It becomes an awareness that the first shock of pain means that I get, we use the language of sacred attunement. It's a rupture. It's a caesura. It breaks you out of the fugue state that we live in most of the time. So at the most limited way, the experience of pain takes you out of the fugue state, and it puts you into a level of reflection. I'm not a person who's going through this in the primary way, is just suffering, but it can be a catalyst to reflection and awareness. And that I remember many years ago, I gave a course on Job and the Problem of Evil in Chicago, and I think I began by saying something about part of the book is helping us to think with our bodies. and the suffering of our bodies as a so it's not just thinking with pleasure. There's a different angle of inflection that happens when we become aware of suffering and loss and diminution in all kinds of ways. I think it's a call to conscience, perhaps in a way that the pleasure principle isn't. But that's a gesture. I would invite people to think to read my discussion on the book of Job, where it actually I use that both to articulate what I call an ontological ethics. It's a revelation that doesn't come from Sinai. It's a revelation that comes through pain. And it begins in ontological ethics. But then I use that as a fulcrum to move back to the tradition. And how I try to do that is the work of the subsequent chapters. So I'll invite people to brood on that. But the question is real, and it was central to my own trying to how it takes us back to your first issue, why theology in our day. Eyes wide open is the suffering, the brutality. The casualness of other people's suffering and the disregard. It's an attempt to kind of bring us back to the acuteness of awareness. So that's the beginning of theology. And sometimes we have a good insight that helps, sometimes the texts help. I hope a little bit of both worked out in Fragile Finitude.
Professor Michael Fishbane, thank you. I've got through about 3 of my 30 questions, but such is the nature of a deeply rich discussion. Thank you for your generosity. And I want to just make a couple plugs. One that our guest of honor cannot make himself, of course, or won't make himself, but read Fragile Finitude, and we have the coupon code from University of Chicago Press on the website for this event. So go get your 30% discount. It's an extraordinary book just published this month. And also for those in the Revelation and Modern Jewish Thought class, we'll be meeting on Tuesday at 2:10 with Michael Fishbane.
That's 5 o'clock my time. Okay, it's good to know.
Yeah, right. 5:10 Eastern Standard, if that's where you find yourself. And
that's where I am. I'm Eastern Standard.
we'll be discussing sacred attunement, especially, but Michael Fishbane's thought in general, including this recent material. And if you're not in that class and you would like to join, please email me, and I will give you a link to join us. And I'll invite Dina up to close us off here.
Thank you. First, let me thank you, Sam, so much for the joy of seeing who you are and have become and becoming, and the kinds of the thoughtfulness that of expressing theology. I think that your students and colleagues should be very grateful to have you as a conversation partner. So thank you for the invitation, and thank you for challenging me to think honestly with you in conversation. I think we were doing living theology, and I thank you for that.
Thank you.
And thank you also, Professor Aronoff.
Thank you. I will just add my voice to a chorus of thank yous. I feel that together we really touched on the vastness of experience while also kind of touching its limits. And I think that's the dance that your writings and your thought invite us into. So I'm delighted that you're going to be visiting the seminar and joining our community yet again in that capacity. Thank you to everyone who joined us here, and we hope to see you again very soon.
Thank you
Bye-bye.
all.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Sam, you'll send me the link for the when it comes. Thank you, Dina. Thank you so much. Lovely to meet you, really.
Very nice to meet you. Bye-bye, everyone.